And on our roundtable, we'll dig into the opportunity gap and look for causes and possible solutions. With us are three leading thinkers on the topic. Prudence Carter is Professor of Education and Sociology at Stanford University and Faculty Director of the John W. Gardner Center for Youth and Their Communities. She's from Mississippi originally and got her BA at Brown University in Applied Mathematics and Economics and has a master's from Teachers College and a PhD from Columbia University as well. Sean Reardon's also with us, and he's also a professor of education and sociology at Stanford, specializing in research on the effects of educational policy on inequality and on the causes and consequences of social and educational inequality. He has a BA from Notre Dame and his PhD from Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And Kevin Wellner is a professor at the University of Colorado, Boulder, at their School of Education, specializing in educational policy and the law. He's director of the National Education Policy Center there, and he earned both his JD and PhD from UCLA. Welcome to all of you, and Prudence, I'd like to start with you. You and Kevin co-edited a book in the last year, a collection of pieces on this subject we're talking about today. You called it Closing the Opportunity Gap. We seem to be talking much more now about opportunity gap versus achievement gap. Is that important?
Absolutely, Jane. And it's important because it's focusing our attention more on the inputs of the process and what actually shapes the outcomes, which we've been so fixated on over the last several decades, which are the test scores. So the achievement gap has really been more about the disparities in how children perform in terms of test score performances or outcomes, or in terms of graduation rates, college-going rates, whereas the opportunity gap really reshifts and focuses our attention on what really determines whether or not a child or a student will perform well on tests or will graduate from high school or will go on to college. And what are those? And those are the things that we argue need to be focused on and policy needs to direct its attention to.
Sean, give us, in your mind, the most important statistics defining and demonstrating that opportunity gap.
Jane, I think the most striking statistic today is the fact that the educational outcomes, including achievement gaps and college-going gaps, have widened over the last few decades, so that now the difference between high and low-income children is about 40% larger on achievement gaps than it used to be about 30 or 40 years ago. So we're seeing an increase in educational inequality, which is one of the symptoms of the opportunity gap that Prudence was talking about. Why
is the gap not narrowing?
When we look closely at the data over the last 50 years, we see that the gap between high and low-income students on achievement tests stays about the same from kindergarten all the way through 8th grade and through high school. So the reason it's widening seems to be about something that's been happening in early childhood, that is, more unequal opportunities for kids to achieve the kind of school readiness they need to get to kindergarten.
Prudence, is this new information about early childhood?
It's not new information for those who have been experts in the field and who have been paying attention to it. And in fact, in one of the chapters in our volume, written by Steve Barnett and his colleague, really focuses on early childhood, and it canvasses the landscape of what we know about early childhood education. And so it's not new information, it's whether or not our attention has been directed to it. And it now seems to be the case that it's entering at least the discussion at the national and state and local policy levels about what we need to do, given what the data say.
And I would add that in terms of what Sean was saying and what Prudence is saying, that there are measurements of what we see as an achievement gap at entry into school that indicate that about half of what we see coming out of formal education as an achievement gap already exists when kids are entering school. But all of those issues of resources and opportunities in the first 4 or 5 years of life continue for children throughout their entire schooling career. And so when we talk about this difference between achievement gap and opportunity gap, for us, the story here is really about a restoration of balance. There's a growing recognition that children learn when they have opportunities to learn, and when those opportunities are absent, children will learn a lot less. And opportunity gaps arise because of differences in formal schooling opportunities, as well as poverty and wealth and race-related opportunities from outside the school. And that's what we try to document in the book. And when we talk about this restoration of balance, we're not saying to ignore achievement gaps by any means, but we're saying that we need to understand and heed opportunity gaps in order to address those achievement gaps.
Kevin, if you say that 50% of that gap is there when children arrive at school, the other 50%, if I've read the writings of all of you carefully, doesn't all come from disparities in the classroom. A lot of that is after school, summer, the kinds of enrichment opportunities that really vary between classes. Is that correct?
Right, and it's from opportunities. And I should point out the 50% number. Whenever we're talking about achievement gaps, we're talking about a variety of different things, and there are different ways of measuring them. So I say one measure would suggest about 50%. But clearly, there's a big difference between the opportunities that kids have, that some kids have versus other kids in terms of very early life. And so yes, these things that we're talking about, these enrichment opportunities, these health opportunities, these safety opportunities, all these things are accumulated throughout a child's life. In fact, throughout a person's life. And when we talk about an achievement gap at a given point, we're talking about something that arises in part because of schooling opportunities, but in part because of all these things that are happening outside of school.
Kevin, part of your research looks at the use and misuse of research in education policymaking. In K-12 education, it seems like new research is released daily. Most of us consuming it have no idea if it's quality research or garbage, frankly. Give us an example of education policy impacted by research that's not solid or distorted in our conversation.
Well, I think that for the most part, what we end up with in terms of policymakers and others chasing after approaches that are not supported by research is a real strong desire to find quick fixes, to find the magic bean, the silver bullet. And when offered a choice of sustained investment in best practices that are going to pay off over a long period of time, versus the attraction of one of these magic bullets, I don't think we can be too surprised when policymakers grab the latter. And so we see that right now with certainly a lot of the school choice and privatization policies. All we have to do is change the management of a school from one approach to another, and somehow that will change kids' learning experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, kids learn when they have opportunities to learn. And if we're not coming up with an approach that changes what actually happens in the classroom, in the school, than simply making some sort of superficial change and hoping that our wishful thinking will somehow pay off is really unwise and harmful to our kids. And in the context of what we were discussing earlier about the need to shift from achievement gap thinking to opportunity gap thinking, a lot of what we've done with No Child Left Behind and the current approaches, including Race to the Top, is to invest very heavily in measuring outcomes and demanding that schools and parents and teachers somehow meet those demands without thinking about the capacity building necessary to get there. So those would be two examples.
Prudence, does that contribute to the cynicism that people feel, this sort of sense that there might be a magic bullet, let's measure it, it looks like it's promising, it's going to work, oh no, maybe it isn't? Is that what we're in the midst of?
Well, I think both our policymakers and our educators are under quite a bit of pressure to produce results because we've been stuck in this achievement gap frame for so long that the metric that is looked at is the percentages or the growth change in those particular numbers, those test scores, those college scoring rates, those high school graduation rates. So there's quite a bit of angst and anxiety in the country right now about moving those numbers towards the positive, growing those numbers. And so we want a quick fix. And, you asked about policies and how the relationship between research and policy. One of the things that we might have to be careful about now is even with the early child care or early child education, because the moniker or the descriptive that has to be there is high quality early childhood education. it's not all early childhood education is good early childhood education. It has to be high quality. And so where we need to focus our attention on is, well, what are those components, for example? And that takes time to grow. How do we get a well-trained early childhood teacher corps? What are the kinds of inputs we need in the classroom in terms of, curricula, in terms of educational toys and tools, those kinds of things, in terms of anything that needs to scaffold certain kids who come in with other kinds of larger challenges because they don't come from affluence or strong or high middle-class backgrounds. So these are the kinds of things we have to be careful about. We hear the bullet, we hear the new monikers, we hear the new buzzword or phrase or the new policy that may be the direction to go towards, but we have to go deeper in terms of thinking about what that means. And that really is, I think, one of the key things that we can focus on in terms of policy and practice.
We'll talk a little later on more about early childhood. That's a very interesting point. Sean, it's important to say that we're talking about socioeconomics here when we talk about the opportunity gap and not race. How does the disparity between racial groups compare with that between classes?
Well, one of the things I think Americans should be very proud of but not yet satisfied by is the enormous amount of progress we've made in improving equality of educational outcomes by race. So the black-white achievement gap, the Hispanic-white achievement gap are both about half the size now nationally as they were about 40 years ago. And those are continuing to decline over the last 10 or 20 years. We see a kind of slow but steady decline in those gaps. So we've made historically great progress on those. Now we're still far from eliminating those gaps, and there's a lot of racial inequality remaining in the kinds of experiences and opportunities students have. But we shouldn't forget that it's possible to make progress and that we have made progress over the last 40 years. That, of course, stands in contrast with the lack of progress we've made on the socioeconomic gaps.
Sean, in a New York Times piece, you made the case that in-school time is not as much of a problem in the opportunity gap as the years before school starts, summers, and after school every single day. We referenced this earlier. Is that true?
Schooling is, on the whole, a kind of equalizing force in society. It's not equalizing enough to overcome the broader inequalities in society and the broader opportunity disparities that students have. But when you look just at test scores and test score gaps, those actually go down during the school year, and then they widen again over the summer.
Kevin, this leads me to wonder a little bit about school funding disparities, which I would have thought contributed hugely to the opportunity gap.
We have a wonderful chapter in the Closing the Opportunity book by two historians, Cantor and Lowe, where they talk about this idea of educationalizing the welfare state. And what they're talking about there is this idea that when we see a social need in society, we tend to look to our schools to address it. You had recently Jeffrey Canada on your show, I believe. Mm-hmm. And what he's doing with the Harlem Children's Zone is, in a way, educationalizing, but in a way, it's addressing a larger need in society. So it's saying we can make schools the center of a set of community resources. And so when we think about how the role that schools can play and the role that school funding and equalizing school funding can play, we need to understand that within this larger context of what we're expecting schools to do. And as we ask schools to do more and more, we certainly need to provide the resources for them to do those things. But we are also placing a bet that we can have a largely unequal society and then a largely equal school system, and at the end of the day, avoid the reproduction of inequalities from generation to generation. We've lost that bet so far. Now, as Sean points out, most of the inequalities that we're able to document, at least in test scores, show up because of things we can account for outside of schools. But if we continue to make these demands on schools, we're going to have to do a lot more than providing roughly equal funding and resources to schools. We're going to have to provide a great deal of extra resources to help schools play this larger role we're asking of them.
Prudence, let's talk about strategies to address the gaps. What is the most impactful change we could make?
Let me say that the opportunity gap is really about the ecosystem in which children and groups of children, thrive or not. And so that the policy goals that we should be targeting are both in school and outside of school. So we have to address kids' basic individual needs. Do they have access to basic health care? Because the kids who come to school hungry can't learn. They can't focus. That's what the research does tell us. We have to address the fact of whether or not they even have access to high-quality schools. Then there are those other things that link schools to their wider communities. How do we build solid, stable homes and communities and neighborhoods so that our schools can thrive and our children can thrive when they leave schools daily? And so that means coupling or marrying educational policy to other social policies. The opportunity gap is about the entire holistic opportunity context. And I think the metaphor that really hits it home for me is that we're asking classes of children to reach the same level. Let's say a metaphor, reach floor 16, i.e., go to college, graduate from college. Some kids have access to elevators that are like at bullet train speed to get there. Some kids are on, escalators and elevators that are well-oiled. And we have a lot of kids in this country who are on broken stairwells with no handrails and broken or missing steps. And we're saying you all have to get there at a comparable speed. And that's what the achievement gap discussion has been about, that they don't get there at the comparable speed, but they have such disparate modes of transportation or methods of getting there. And that's what we're trying to focus on with the opportunity gap.
Sean, talking about the context of children's lives, we hear a lot about parenting, especially children of low-income families. Is there evidence to support a massive push on education in that area?
Well, I don't know that we should think of it as educating low-income parents, but I think we ought to do three things. We ought to make it much easier for parents to be their children's first and best teacher, and we do that by providing a better safety net and making it sure that the parents don't have to spend all their time worrying about making sure there's a roof over their children's head and food on the table so that they can focus on their children's cognitive development. Second, we ought to focus on high-quality early childhood educational opportunities for children, regardless of their socioeconomic background. And third, we ought to focus on equalizing the kind of access to high-quality, challenging, high-level curriculum and instruction in the K to 12 years. Now, all three of those things are hard to do, but if we did all three of those things, we would be much, much closer to sort of being the America we think we are, that is a land where the circumstances of your birth don't correspond to where you end up as an adult.
Kevin, those birth to 5 years, some people say are enormously impactful. CEOs, the president, great investment, great returns. Others say not so fast. The benefits don't last more than a couple of years. It's really not worth it. Where do you come out on this? Where are the data?
When you look at high-quality early childhood programs and you look at low-income children whose alternative would be either low-quality early childhood setting, whether that's a child care setting that's not very cognitively stimulating, or no child care or preschool. When you look at that contrast, you see big effects. And while sometimes some of the effects seem to sort of go away after time, they reemerge later in life in many cases. And so the investment in early childhood in some of these long-term studies has shown long-term payoffs when the contrast is between sort of high-quality early childhood programs and a less cognitively stimulating environment.
The economic analyses of the best programs, the ones that are well done and sort of small and easily measured, show payoffs in the neighborhood of the teens to 1, like 13, 14 to 1. The larger programs, the ones that aren't as well controlled and that are more sweeping, still have payoffs in the neighborhood of 7 to 1. So we're talking about a very smart long-term investment, but again, it needs to be done in a smart way.
Prudence, do the American people care enough about this gap, this opportunity gap, to make a real investment in these changes?
Jane, I want to believe that the American people care enough about it. I think the reality is that most Americans focus more their attention on their own children's realities, which sometimes distracts us from thinking about what we can do to help others who are less fortunate. But this is a democratic society. This is a country that wants to thrive, that wants to do well. It is in our best interest to care about others at this point, given the changing demographics. We know that, and one issue we didn't get to is the fact that we have a burgeoning population of English language learners in this country, which is another policy focus. And many of those children come from unfortunate or disadvantaged circumstances. So we have to care about them if we want to think in terms of our long-term economic productivity, because they will be the majority in the future of this country.
Well, that will be our last word. Prudence Carter, Sean Reardon, and Kevin Wellner, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.